This is TWiT.
Big revelation from the information, speaking of great journalism, about a Tim Cook deal with the Chinese worth $275 billion. Now, this goes back in time to 2015. You may remember around 2016, it was getting harder and harder for Apple to work in China. Apple's iPhone sales were plummeting. Apple apparently, Cook decided to go to the country, meet with senior leadership, made a 5-year agreement in secret. This is the first time that's been reported in 2016 to quash a sudden burst of regulatory actions against Apple's business. This is Wayne Ma writing for the information. Before the meetings, Apple executives were scrambling to salvage the company's relationship with Chinese officials who believed the company wasn't contributing enough to the local economy. So Cook very effectively took charge here. And now the real question is, now does that mean Apple is kind of in the back pocket of the Chinese Communist Party? They kept this agreement secret. The information quotes a political economist at the University of California, San Diego, Victor Shi, who says Apple, as a global company, needs to appease the Chinese government because China is a large market and a large production base for Apple. But at the same time, the vast majority of its consumers are still located outside of China. And as their opinion has turned increasingly negative toward China, Apple likely wanted to avoid the optics of groveling to the Chinese government. I don't know if it's fair to say grovel. They announced a investment in DD Global, $1 billion investment. That's the Uber of China. They went to China. Jeff Williams, Lisa Jackson, and CEO Cook went to China to meet with the Chinese government leaders at their secretive leadership compound, Zhongnanhai. Neither side disclosed details of the visit, but they signed an economic deal with China worth, according to the information, $275 billion. Microsoft, this is not the first. Microsoft did similar things in years earlier, somewhat smaller commitments. Cisco did the same thing. These deals are technically non-binding, but Chinese officials take them more seriously than officials in other countries do. They are more binding than you would think. An international attorney who writes about Chinese law, Dan Harris from Harris Bricken. What do you think? I mean, you can then trace this to China kind of moving its servers, its iCloud servers, to the Chinese mainland last year, perhaps bowing to Chinese pressure to remove VPN apps from the App Store in China, to go so far as to change maps. So as not to offend the Chinese government. And it's made a difference. iPhone sales have suddenly gone up in China considerably. China's State Bureau of Surveying and Mapping told members of the Apple Maps team sometime in 2014 or 2015 to make the Diaoyu Islands appear large even when users zoomed out. This is, oh my God. This is there's been a long-running dispute between China and Japan over who owns those islands. Chinese regulators threatened to withhold approval of the first Apple Watch if they didn't change the maps, so they did. So apparently when you view the Diaoyu Islands in Apple Maps, they appear on a larger scale, they still do, than surrounding territories. It's interesting the things governments want you to do. Chinese regulators ordered Apple to shut down its iTunes store for China 6 months after it launched in 2016 because it didn't have the necessary, quote, content licenses. But they fixed that. So it's not surprising to hear that China and Apple have some sort of back channel agreement.
Backdoor.
Yeah, backdoor agreements. How do we feel about that? Shira, does it bother you?
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like it continues to feed into their BS and their continuation of just like putting a chokehold on the entire world. I mean, they literally it's wrong and it's dangerous. But then it's like, what are companies supposed to do unless they decide not to be in bed with them and not to make these agreements?
Yeah, like Google famously said, well, goodbye, China.
And at a certain point, someone needs to do that. I mean, like, you can continue doing these deals. What, now that deal is over, possibly they need to pay them now even more. Like, until companies take a stand and say, like, we're going to lose this money, but then gain more on the other side of it, like take a stand against China, nothing is going to change. I think it's really dangerous and it's getting worse.
China revenue from the Greater China, which includes Taiwan, 68 billion. China now represents 19. That's to Apple. 19% of Apple's total sales. That's a big chunk of your market. So yeah, this is the question: is how far do you go to appease a totalitarian regime when it's a fifth of your market? Will you just do whatever they say? They withhold currently privacy features for Chinese users. They comply with China's data security law, requiring foreign companies to store more data about Chinese users in the country. At that point,
profiting
by the way,
against like human rights violations.
Right. At that point, by the way, Microsoft's LinkedIn and Yahoo discontinued their Chinese operations rather than accede to those demands. They censor the App Store and news, of course, things like Tiananmen Square, VPNs, LGBTQ-related apps blocked.
I think that
Go ahead, Carolina.
I was going to say is the price of doing business in China, and you need to make a decision whether or not, from a company perspective, it is worth you doing so, not just from a business perspective, but from an ethical perspective and who you want to be as a brand. I'm not surprised that Cook took care of it himself, because obviously his pedigree has been a supply chain. He spent a lot of time in China working with government from a supply chain perspective, so is very well connected, and he knows how to talk to people. I do think that the reason why maybe they don't get the scrutiny that they should is because the impact is on Chinese people, not necessarily on people internationally. Yeah. And so, people are quite happy to kind of turn the other way and not be concerned about it. But the question is, how far they go to fit into what the Chinese government is requesting for their own user. I don't really think the increase in smartphone sales is necessarily linked to the deal that they made. There was a boycott of Apple for a certain period of time because it's the U.S. brand with the biggest presence in China, that came as a result of a ban on Huawei here in the U.S. But it was very short-lived, and people didn't really seem to care enough, I suppose, about Huawei not to buy Apple in China. But generally, consumers have stayed with the brand, and the increase in sales has way more to do with the products that they're selling and, the design of the iPhone and so forth that came with the recent models, but not necessarily the deal. What is interesting, though, is that, the companies that you're talking about, Google, LinkedIn, all of those companies is more on a services side than not the hardware side. Apple is depending on hardware. They're not really making a great deal of revenue from a services perspective. Is really all on hardware sales.
Well, that's changing, though, rapidly with Apple. Services are becoming
outside of China, for sure. Yeah, but not necessarily in China.
Yeah, they're kind of foregoing that, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
Alex, this is something big tech in general has to face. If you want to be a global company, you're going to deal with less savory characters, shall we say, and you have to make this decision. How do they deal with this?
Well, I think that the other big tech companies are handling it better. I mean, find me a company that's more smug, more self-satisfied, more moralistic, more preachy in its marketing than Apple. Talking about what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone and how you could really trust it. And then you see what it's doing. I mean, getting in bed with the CCP, and they have their data storage in servers that are owned by Chinese Communist Party subsidiaries. So, I think that every company needs to make its own determination about like what it will compromise to operate in China, because it's always going to be a compromise. But I think that like for Apple to do this and then persist with its marketing messages, to me, is extremely hypocritical. And I think eventually it catches up with the company. I mean, people will eventually start looking at this stuff weird if they continue to see this news about Apple.
That's a really good point. I don't know if there would be so much criticism if they weren't so sanctimonious about it. They've kind of brought it on themselves, in other words.
No doubt. I think the sanctimony, it works for them. They're viewed as a luxury brand, but, Steve Jobs, but when he talked about marketing, he said it really is, you got a short amount of time to tell people who you are and what you stand for. And if Apple's telling us it's about privacy and safety and security on one hand, and then doing these things that we're seeing in China on the other, that marketing will no longer align with what it actually stands for and who it is. And I think it will fall apart.